All right. So good afternoon, everyone, or maybe good morning from some of you, or maybe it's evening time for you. Welcome to the Siena Solutions Challenge Introduction to Challenge-Based Learning webinar. My name is Carissa Nelson, and I'm the project manager on our learning experience design team here at Digital Promise. And I'm going to shortly kind of turn it over to my colleague, Anthony Baker, to introduce himself very quickly. He'll be kind of walking us through this interactive guide of challenge-based learning. So Anthony, you want to give a short spiel?
It helps when you unmute yourself before you begin these things. Anthony Baker, happy to see everybody. I'm a project director at Digital Promise, have done a lot of work with challenge-based learning, particularly in trying to connect it to content areas. So I've worked a lot in science in particular is my background, but we've seen challenge-based learning work across all different kinds of content areas. And for me, it's really about student agency, like improving that, pathways to more equitable classrooms. And it's exciting to think you all might be interested in doing some of that work in your own classrooms. So thanks for joining.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. And so like Anthony said, for the next sort of 45 minutes, we'll be walking you all through an interactive experience of the challenge-based learning framework. And I just wanted to kind of share our agenda for today. So we'll have a short overview of the Siena Solutions Challenge, an overview of the challenge-based learning framework, and then we'll run through a really fun activity around challenge-based learning and a short moment for reflection and discussion. And so just a few kind of housekeeping before we begin. For some of you, it may be early in the morning or you may be closing out your workday. Today's meeting is really interactive, and so we do encourage you to all sort of interact with us, either through the chat box, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, you are more than welcome to. We have sort of a nice sized group today, so a perfect opportunity for us to kind of talk with one another and get to know each other. But if you are also in a place where you can't actually talk and you'd much rather prefer to kind of stay off screen and rather talk through the chat box, you're more than welcome to do that. We want to make sure that everyone kind of is comfortable where they are and comfortable to engage where they are. So if you can go to the next slide. Great. So I just kind of want to give everyone an overview of the Siena Solutions Challenge. Maybe this is your first time hearing about the challenge. This is the first webinar that you've joined where we're talking about it. Essentially, the Siena Solutions Challenge is a global design challenge that invites middle and high school students to essentially design solutions to real problems that are happening in their local community, and essentially kind of taking those issues and creating actionable sort of solutions to build a better world. And this challenge invites educators to engage in the challenge-based learning framework. And so Anthony will go over, exactly what this sort of framework looks like, but essentially the challenge asks students to design anything where they can actually leverage digital tools. So it kind of encourages them to ask big questions, think really thoughtfully, and take action to design what those solutions are. And so I'll have a little bit more later, but I want to actually go ahead and turn it over to Anthony as he discusses the challenge-based learning framework with everyone. So Anthony, take it away.
Thanks, Carissa. So I'm just going to give you kind of the 30,000 foot view of challenge-based learning here. We could spend multiple hours digging into the nuance of it, but this is an opportunity to kind of learn what it's all about. Just as a little bit of a history lesson, this actually started at Apple as Apple Classrooms of Tomorrow Today. And that started way back in, I think, 2007 or 8. It was really about finding exciting opportunities to build digital classrooms that were problem-solving classrooms, right? And that became a Digital Promise project when our former CEO came over from Apple to here, and we've kind of built it into a multidisciplinary, and it's really a framework here. So that's the first thing I want to say, is that this isn't a particular pedagogy. It's not there's no one way to do this correctly. It is a framework for sure. And that means that you are free to kind of design within that framework yourselves. So keep that in mind as we talk about what we're doing today. So what we want to say is that it's a framework, but it engages students in community-based problem solving around real-world challenges. So it does sound a lot like the other based learnings, right? Like a problem-based learning or a project-based learning. But in this case, we're really specifically focused on problem solving in our communities and problem finding as well. And that's the other thing. We want to engage students in problem finding and then solving those problems that they're able to find. So what we want students to collaborate, to think about big ideas, to really ask good questions, and to identify and investigate and solve those challenges that are of interest to them. And so there's a bunch of flexibility built into this framework, right? So we want those students to be able to do things like select the problems that they think are important to solve. We want them to be able to ask the questions that they think are important, and which ones they want to investigate and how they investigate those questions. And we want them to be able to have some decision-making ability when it comes time to solve those problems, right? So in lieu of saying, build a new water filter, we want kids to find a problem that matters to them, and maybe clean water is a problem, but we want them to identify that it is a problem. And then maybe a water filter isn't the way they want to solve that problem, right? So we want to give them that flexibility to come up with a solution that works for them and is of interest to them and engages them in the learning process. So what you'll see is that there's 3 phases, and those phases are the engage, investigate, and act phases. So each one of these phases, they prepare the students to move into the next phase, right? And so to support this, there's this ongoing process of documentation and sharing out and reflecting on what we've learned. If we're in that student mode, if we're thinking about how students think, they are asking questions, they're investigating them, they're documenting it, and they're reflecting on it as a whole in a classroom over the course of all 3 of these. And so this first phase is the engage phase, right? So what you and your students will do is kind of move from an abstract big idea, which might be something like love or health or freedom, right? So like big abstract ideas. And we want to take those and turn them into some sort of actionable challenge that is concrete. And we want to do that through questioning, through essential questioning. So the first thing that you will do, or you may do with your students, is identify a big idea. And so a big idea is this broad theme or concept that can be explored in multiple ways. And it's important to you and your larger community. And it's important, I think, when we're talking about a big ideas, to focus in on the big part, which is that if you make your big ideas too small, it's going to limit the potential number of challenges and solutions to come out of this. So we want to think big, right? So think about health, think about safety. And so then you go through the essential questioning process, which is going to help students in contextualizing this big idea and personalizing it, making it like matter to them. And so the product of that process is a single essential question that's relevant to either an individual or a group or the entire class, however you've decided to kind of chunk out that work. And then what we do with essential questions is we turn them into a call to action, right? So a challenge, we call them challenges and challenge-based learning, but it's a call to action to, and it asks students, like, learn about the problems that you've identified, develop a solution to that problem that is meaningful to you and your community. And we want them to be actionable for sure. In the investigate phase, you and your students, you're going to identify guiding questions. So the guiding questions are essentially, what do you need to know and know how to do to actually solve the challenge that you've identified? So you're going to take some resources, maybe things that already exist, right? Maybe you as a teacher have brought some resources to this situation. Maybe there's new things out there. Maybe there's experiments that kids want to run that don't exist yet, right? Maybe there's learnings to be had. And they can do those without asking these questions first, right? So you use these guiding activities and resources to answer these questions during the engage, investigate phase. And then so all students are involved in this process in some way. And again, I do want to say that How you decide to break up your work in your classrooms is kind of up to you. So it's totally feasible that in a class, each individual student might have their own challenge and might have their own guiding questions and come up with their own solution. Or maybe groups of 3 to 4 want to do that. Or maybe the entire class solves the same challenge, but they do it in different ways. So all of that's very flexible by design. So these guiding questions, they're the things that point students toward knowledge that they need to develop. And just because you ask a question in one place doesn't mean more questions won't pop up. I think what we've seen in implementations of this is that we ask students to develop their first set of guiding questions. And as they work through those guiding questions through activities and resources, more questions are generated and we have to answer those as well. And I think we want that to happen for sure. So, and again, those guiding activities and resources are used to answer those guiding questions. And sometimes those are student created, sometimes those are teacher created. So you might know ahead of time that if we're working on public safety, kids need to know something about traffic patterns. So I'm going to have ready to go as a teacher. I know I'm going to have some data about that, or I know I'm going to have an activity where they can do some traffic analysis. That's just one example that, you know, an activity or a resource that you might have in your back pocket ready to go. And then synthesis is really important too. It's at the end of this investigate phase where what you do is you want to look back at all of the questions that you asked and answered and what you learned and turn that into some sort of synthesis so that you have your learning. I did these things, I learned X. I did these things, I learned Y. And now I know this thing, this synthesis, right? And then you can use that to move on to the next phase, which is the ACT phase where you're developing solution concepts. So you're developing action concepts here, and you're going to take an action towards a solution. So we're going to develop, I say we as students and teachers, because you are a learner in this process as well. We're going to develop an evidence-based solution. We're going to implement it with an authentic audience. So that can take the many, many different forms. So an authentic audience might be the school board. An authentic audience might be the local council on aging. Authentic audience might be a manufacturer's council, right? It just depends on the scope of the challenge and who you're working to serve. And then you're going to evaluate that based on the results that you have. So these action concepts, these are the things that emerge from your findings. And then kids are going to get engaged in the design cycle where they test and iterate and test to see what works for them. They're going to implement with that authentic audience, and then they're going to evaluate it to see how effective it is, and then make adjustments or make plans for sustaining their implementation, right? So you can imagine a world where kids want to make more green space in their community, right? And maybe their first time around, they plant things that are annual, right? So they only grow for the year, and then they realize the next year they have to go back out and plant them again. So maybe they think, well, let's mix some perennial plants into our green space. And so those are the kind of things that only happen when you take that kind of iterative design cycle approach and think about sustainability. So before we jump into our activity, I'll give you the floor. If there are any questions, I want you guys to feel free, guys and gals, to feel free to stop me and ask any questions you have. You can put them in the chat. You can unmute yourself. But I'll give us just a pause before we move into an activity. Okay. Well, in that case, we're going to move on. Oh.
May I have one question?
Yes, please ask a question.
This is Shivaji from India.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have heard that we need to do something digital games and other things. So is it essential?
So I will kind of defer to Carissa on this, but my understanding of the Siena Challenge is that it doesn't have to be digital in like games. There are ways to use digital solutions that aren't necessarily existing technologies. So Carissa, can you expand on that?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. We encourage, students to and educators both to submit any sort of product or some sort of design leveraging digital tools. So this doesn't mean that the tool itself needs to be, the most fanciest sort of tool or the most, advanced technology tool. It's really whatever your students sort of have access to in terms of technology resources, whatever they have access to and want to be able to use to leverage their design solutions, we encourage that. Things that could be submitted could be anything from a product or a campaign, or maybe an interactive map or an interactive game even, or an app. Anything that pretty much leverages a digital tool or technology that your students have access to.
Yeah, so it's not that they necessarily have to create something technological, it's that they should use technology in the solution that they develop.
Thanks for using the word existing technology. I got it. Very happy.
Yes, great. Thanks for your question. I see a question from Moses in Uganda. He asks, should these activities be restricted to the learning curriculum, or can learners venture out of the official curriculum? If you're asking for my personal opinion, I think you should follow the kids where they take you, right? Like that's the way what I think is beautiful about this. But I think that's definitely a question for you and the implementing teachers to discuss with their administration. I think certainly when the administration gives you a thumbs up on saying like, do some of our core curriculum, but let the kids, like, you could put the guardrails up. Don't squeeze them in out here, but like leave the guardrails up out here so they can do a little exploration. Does that answer your question? Well, we'll leave it at, I hope that answers your question. And that a lot of that's kind of personal opinion. So, oh, great, satisfactory, awesome. Okay, so before we move on, any other questions? All right, so today we would love for you to participate in this. It'll be a lot more fun if we can get everybody chiming in when available to do so. What we have are a couple of things. One, we're going to talk about this CBL workspace. So I'm going to pull this up so you can see it. This should be public, so you can have access to this, and Carissa will put it in the chat for us. She's done that. So each one of these slides, you can take a slide and make it your own. And it's just a place for you to do some work and some note taking and some reflection on what you're thinking. The second thing I want to highlight is this idea of a student hat, right? So this activity today, I would like you to kind of take the place of your students for a moment, right? So when I ask you to reflect on things, or we go through this process, if you're a 7th grade math teacher, think about the kids sitting in your 7th grade math class. If you are a high school social studies teacher, think about the kid that's always goofing around in the back row, or think about the very studious kid in the front row, whatever it is. Just get yourself into the student mindset for a little bit. And then from time to time, I'm going to pull you back where I can, and we'll say, okay, let's talk like teachers about this for a minute. Or librarians, or whomever is joining us today. So that's another thing to say. I talk a lot from a teacher perspective because I was myself a teacher, and I work a lot with teachers. But this framework can be used by everybody in education. So away we go. So I've got a big idea for you. We're going to start with this big idea of public health. So as we watch this video, what I'd like you to do is take noticings and wonderings, right? So watch the video, listen to what is said, see the people and what they have to say. And then in that CBL workspace, make some notes for you, or keep it in your brain so that we can share out when we're done.
So it might not seem like it, but it's the middle of the day here.
I'm going to stop there and ask Carissa if she can hear me. You can hear that? Okay, great.
In Beijing, the air is so polluted that it's darkened the sky. Now, recent studies show that even breathing this kind of air for an hour can reduce a person's life expectancy by 20 minutes. It's akin to being a heavy smoker, smoking a pack and a half of cigarettes every day. So we wanted to know, how are people in this city coping with the bad air?
I'm trying to avoid going outside. My throat hurts. I think people should drive less, and all the factories should be shut down.
I don't have a face mask, I am used to the bad air now because I always work on the streets. On days like this, it's very easy to fall ill. The smog definitely harms people's health.
I have to keep working to earn a living. I haven't bought any face masks. Pollution is a serious issue, but ordinary people like me have no say in how to deal with it.
That pessimism is widespread. Recent surveys show the majority of people in China's biggest cities have little faith the polluted air will improve in the next 5 years. Despite pledges coming out of the Paris conference, most believe the dirty air is here to stay. Celia Hatton, BBC News, Beijing.
All right, so thanks everyone for bearing with us while we watch that short video. I would love to, if you would, in the chat or in your workspace, or even unmute yourself and share, what did you notice about that? And what did you wonder about? Carissa, do you want to kick us off? What did you notice and wonder about?
So I think the first thing that I noticed is, well, one of the first thing I noticed is just that everyone was wearing masks, which feels very relevant to what is happening right now in sort of the world that we're living in. But then I just noticed how just like everyone was really sort of, or folks in the community were really sort of, not eager is not the right word, but really just compelled to say something around, you know, sort of the air pollution and everything that they were sort of experiencing, and identified exactly how it made them feel. And so it made me sort of like empathize with them, but then also what was impacted as a result of the air pollution. So those were some things that I noticed on like right away.
Great. Anybody else who, and remember, we're in our student hats right now. Any other notices or wonderings, things that you are interested in?
It was very difficult to breathe because of the pollution.
Yeah. And what I noticed and I wondered about, there was one gentleman who basically said, I can't afford a mask, right? I can't afford to do this, right? So Brenda says there's a lack of power to even impact it. What can one individual person do? Yeah, for sure. So the next question, so me as a teacher, I'm going to ask you as students, so how is this like something you or your community experiences? And so I'll actually share first, and people can follow me if they want. So I live in a very rural area. So there's not a lot of cars causing smog necessarily, but there is a lot of agriculture. So lots of food being grown. And what we notice is that it's around August, September, October, when they start cutting down crops, we notice that our air quality here just gets terrible. So it's really hazy in the mornings and it's hard to breathe and people get coughs because I think a lot of that stuff is being cut into, you know, like a lot of dust being thrown up into the air. So that's one of the ways I think we as a kind of rural community deal with the impacts of air pollution. Would anybody else like to share? So let's move on to what should we do? Like what essential questions should we answer? And so if we take a time out and we think about, as a teacher, who would implement this, or a librarian or whomever. So my job is to get the students excited about this, to get them engaged in it, to get them thinking about their own community in terms of this big idea, right? And so now what I want to get them to do is now come up with an essential question, right? So we might land on this essential question through conversation, which is, how might we address air quality in our community? And what I want to say about this is, this question it's not super specific. It is wide open enough that students can address air quality in multiple ways. So some students might come up with one idea, and some students might come up with a totally different way to address that essential question. And so you can't do that unless you leave your options open wide enough. And so here's where we would then develop our challenges, right? So we're getting towards the end of the engage phase now, and we're going to develop challenges. So what I would say to you, if we put our student hats back on, how do you as an individual, what do you want to do to address air quality issues in your community, right? To Brenda's point, they feel a lack of power. So what do you specifically want to do about it? So I would love to hear out from anybody who thinks, what might a student in your classrooms or in your schools or in your community say? What do they want to do?
I'm going to jump in here. Anthony, I think that I also used to be a former educator, so I'm coming from the mind of what exactly I think a student would say off the top would be to, give them power, like give them, like kind of create that in terms of a solution, or just kind of something. I feel like students would say they want to solve the problem right away without maybe having a defined idea of what that is. But I wonder if that would resonate with anyone else and what their students could possibly say.
I also feel like my students at 11 and 12, depending on what part of the year it's in, I feel like they would try to influence their parents, and that their solutions would revolve around their family and the situation that they're actually in, and they would have a hard time seeing outside of that bubble.
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's okay for the first time around, right? Like, yeah, that's I think the nature of our when we're not out in the community, particularly now, we're not out in the community quite as much, right? But I think we want to try to drive them towards that, which is like, if you think it's a problem for grandma and grandpa or your aunt or uncle, right, or your brother or sister, like, isn't it a problem for everyone else's aunt and uncle and brother and sister, right? So yeah, I hear that concern for sure. I can tell you that when we've asked students this question, some students say, I want to create a filter, like a low-cost filter, right, for people. I want to, and then I have to stop them and I say, we're not developing solutions yet, right? Like, building an air filter is a solution to the problem. So I love what Brenda's saying here, right? So she's saying, what possible steps can be identified to increase an individual's power, right? So what issues do we want to address? Individuals don't have the ability to change air pollution on their own, right? So like, that's a challenge. A challenge might be empower people to change or to address air pollution, or it might be empower. You can be a little more specific. You could say, like, address traffic issues in my community if it was a pollution driven by traffic, right? And there's lots of ways to solve those problems. There's no one particular way to solve it. So we can give you a challenge, but the solution might be, so use of public transport to avoid the air pollution. What we want to say is, like, your challenge is reduce the number of smog producing cars on the road. And the solution to that, maybe one of them might be to use public transport, right? So we want to stay in the question here as long as possible. What do you want to do? How do we improve air quality? Or how do we empower people? We want to stay in that question and avoid solutions as long as possible so that we can then investigate them and learn some things along the way. So let's imagine we're going to run with this idea of empower an individual to address air pollution in their community. right? So that's your challenge. So now we have to create guiding questions around that. So what would a student need to know to be able to address that challenge? If your challenge is empower an individual to address air pollution, what would a student have to know to be able to do that? Yeah. So Brenda says, what are the sources of air pollution? I think that's a really clear one. Anything else spring to mind? What does everyone need to know?
Actually, Anthony,
Yeah.
My concern is that more than students, I am in a fix that we cannot stop industrialization, and industrialization creates the pollution. And
Yeah.
because of that, I am in the fix. How to find the solution?
Yeah. So I hear that is a concern for you, but I think it's a really interesting question for kids to be engaged in, right? So the thing that I do want to say is, like, at the end of this, it's possible that your solution isn't the same thing that you thought it was going to be at the beginning. And it might be because you realize along the way that it's not feasible. It's probably not feasible for a group of 2 to 3 middle or high school students to address the largest polluters in a community, which are very powerful, corporate interests. That might not be feasible, but there might be some wisdom and learning in that process that helps them do something on a smaller scale. At least I wouldn't want to stop them from trying and then helping them reframe when it comes time to do that. So I see questions about what are the sources of air pollution? What's air pollution composed of? Yeah, so Moses says something similar, right? So what's nice about this is that when one of these things comes along, some students might have a challenge like empower individuals. Some students might say create a device that reduces air pollution. Some students might say improve traffic patterns to reroute like smog producing vehicles outside of a residential area, right? So like address the traffic patterns. And all of those are going to have different sets of guiding questions, but there are some that we can all do together, right? Like, what causes air pollution? What is it? Like, people say air pollution all the time. What's it actually made of? What are the little particles, right? And so as a science teacher, this is what gets me excited, because that's a perfect opportunity to Moses' earlier point, which is like, do you stick in the curriculum? This is a great time for you to connect to it and say, like, during the guiding questions with the activities and resources, yes, we're going to learn about like molecules. We're going to learn about nitrogen dioxide. We're going to learn about carbon monoxide. We're going to learn about chemical reactions and combustion in car engines. Like, all of those things, you can connect to this now, and the students can feel empowered, and I can do it with my whole class before they might go off on their own and do their thing. And so let's imagine that we have these challenges in front of us, right? One of them is like empower an individual, and one of them is address traffic patterns, right? So what strategies might somebody use? So I want to call out that as part of the Siena Challenge, there's a whole library of action pathways and investigation pathways that are going to be opened up to you guys as participants. So you'll have access to these that'll actually help scaffold kids pick the right thing to do. So the Siena and the Digital Promise team have developed this whole process and really created a bunch of helpful facilitation materials for you, such that, to our earlier question about how do we use technology, a lot of that's going to be addressed in the ways that they use action pathways. So can anybody think of, like, what are some investigation methods based on the questions you asked, right? So like, what's pollution made of? Like, maybe one question is, how much pollution does one truck release? Can anybody think of some investigation methods they might use? Like, what might you actually do to answer those questions? Carissa, you got a suggestion?
I do. I'd probably conduct some sort of field research, but I'd want to reach out to like maybe local organizations or even maybe some global, like just looking for organizations that have a focus in maybe air quality and wanting to talk to them a little bit more about what their findings are and sort of like create some sort of balance. But I think that would be my first inclination would be to go do some research in the field and really talk to people who are like experts in this topic.
Yeah, probably be great to talk to like a nurse or like a respiratory therapist, somebody who works with lungs. And you can say like, tell me what you know about what happens to people when they're exposed to this stuff. Field research is great. Another option might be to do some sort of data analysis, right? So you can imagine if you're a mathematics teacher or, you might want to do some statistics on something. You might say, as a student, I want to go out and I want to count how many large trucks drive by this certain intersection over the course of, I don't know, 3 hours or an hour or something like that. Then I'm going to extrapolate it out and I'm going to take that data over 3 different places, right? And then I'll have some kind of inclination, like what's the balance of small passenger vehicles versus large trucks? You might also, as a student, engage in something a teacher created for you. So me as a science teacher, I might build an activity like a stoichiometry activity that shows students how you take gasoline and combust it. And out of that combustion comes some water and then some carbon monoxide, and then you get some sulfur dioxide and nitrogen dioxide, right? So I might do that as a science teacher, just as another activity students can learn together. So after we've gone through all of these investigation activities, right, we've learned some things, then we have to act. And I again want to call out to the facilitation materials you'll have access to when the Siena Challenge relaunches in August. And I don't know that exact date, but Carissa, you can fill that in. You'll have some action pathways to choose from, right? And so what action pathway might make sense given on the kind of questions and challenges you're facing? Anybody have a thought? So if I'm going to riff a little bit on the empowering individuals challenge, I think this is a perfect opportunity to undertake some sort of public awareness campaign, right? So this is where we want to make sure individuals understand the hazards that they're exposed to. So maybe I'm going to create, my action pathway is to create a public awareness campaign. Maybe it's a new hashtag. Maybe it's speaking at public events, right? Maybe it's getting some books donated to the library, but that's like a public awareness campaign to help raise awareness and empower people to understand what they're being exposed to when it comes to air pollution. Carissa, did you have a suggestion?
I don't have a suggestion, but I do have a question, and it's mainly for I'm thinking about individuals and maybe educators who are not in traditional schools. So might be like librarians or after school teachers or someone in that type of role. I'm wondering if there are anyone on the call, or if Anthony, you might have some responses to this. Since their focus is sort of broad, they have a different, it's not the traditional sort of K-12 model. What would be that connecting, what would be that connecting piece for them when trying to develop sort of this action concept with their students? I'm assuming, and just kind of having the context of the framework, is that we would kind of have the students sort of take in these different parts of the challenge and develop their own action concept. But if a teacher or an educator is sort of in this untraditional sort of model of school, like what would I guess you sort of advise them to do in this frame of an action concept when it's there, when they're around this part of the phase? Yeah,
so I would say a couple things. One, that's why it's going to be great to have some facilitation materials available to you, because they'll already be kind of pre-scaffolded for kids, and that'll be helpful. And you knowing your community and your students and what's available to them, you'll be able to highlight those that make the most sense for them. I think the other thing is to kind of let the community lead the way on that, right? So no matter whether you're a librarian or you run an after-school program or you're a classroom teacher, you should have ties to your community in some way. One in particular that I'm thinking about is that there was a librarian who ran like a STEM club that used one of these, and they got connected with, so they realized that I think it was one of their students had a grandparent in a nursing home. They got connected with that nursing home and they went and did some investigation there, and they talked to the people there. And what they found was like that it was really hard for them. They didn't have the dexterity needed to use the utensils that they were given when it was like mealtime, right? And so this was perfect because these kids in this, after the STEM club, this that the librarian ran, all had access to 3D printers. So what they were able to do is actually model some utensils that were better suited for people who don't have the dexterity, right? So in that way, they really let the community drive the solution as opposed to coming in with a predetermined idea that we have to be able to do this thing. And that certainly can be a little scary, but I think the community-driven solutions are the ones that are most effective and that will benefit you and your students the most.
I'd love to hear if anyone else had any action concepts or any ideas that they would kind of bring to their students, or something you can think of that your students would probably develop. And if you don't have any now, that's okay. You can always add them to the chat box or to your CBL workspace and we'll look over it.
Yeah, lots of time to figure it out too. So, I do want to just say, like, this isn't something that happens overnight. This isn't a 2-day process. This takes a while from time to time, like really surveying the needs of your community alone. That part, the easy part is getting people excited about something, especially students, because, they're excitable. The hard part is making sure that we stay in those questions. So.
Awesome. It looks like Brenda had a comment. She's introduced the citizen science site and have a discussion, then ask students what's happening in their community.
Yeah, right. And so that's a really good way to come up with a big idea, right? If you're going to go all the way back. And so with the Sienna Challenge, and Carissa, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're working on SDG 11, right?
Yep,
Sustainable Development Goal. So that's really going to kind of frame your big idea here. In SDG 11 is, Carissa, remind me, it's community, yes?
Community, yes, that's correct.
Okay, right. So this is a perfect fit. So that'll frame a lot of that for you already. So typically at the end of these experiences, I like to ask people to reflect a little bit. So if you think about a very traditional classroom model, or the dynamic that normally exists between a teacher and student, or like authority figures and students, how has the balance of power shifted for a student who might be engaged in this process?
I think that with the balance of power shifting, it really, at least when I look at the framework and in the way that it's sort of communicated, and you think about how often, when you're as an educator, you're in the classrooms, you're talking kind of having that two-way sort of conversation with your students. And typically, as the educator, you're asking you're kind of probing those questions to your students for them to sort of answer it. And I think with the CBL framework, we're kind of inviting students to probe questions about this bigger idea. And I think that alone sort of creates a difference within the way that students are used to sort of learning from an educator. So when I think the question part of it, or the investigation phase rather, I see a lot of that balance of sort of power shifting there.
Yeah, I see Brenda mentions that instructors become coaches and students lead. That's true, right? And I'll come back to that kind of guardrail metaphor. It's all about where you want to squeeze those guardrails in. We definitely want to go on a hike, right? We want to like wander up the mountain this way and that, but maybe we don't want to go way over here. We want to make sure we stay on the path to some degree, right? And your job as a facilitator of this work is to do that, which is to be a sounding board, to be really engaged in helping students who probably aren't really familiar at this point about like asking and investigating their own questions, really helping facilitate that process. Yeah, Moses says that learner motivation is high, and that is absolutely true. And I will tell you, in the research that I've been involved in with these implementations in science classrooms, that is what we saw, is that kids are far more excited when they know that what they're learning is A, going to make a difference in their community, but B, really tied to what they're engaged in. So like it was their question that they're investigating rather than going through the motions of another round of worksheets, for example, right? So when students are really engaged, there's a really good opportunity for us to teach them things that we know that they need to know, but also for them to grow as learners as well. So I think, Carissa, at this point, we can wrap up. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Anthony, for kind of facilitating that experience with us. And I hope that everyone was able to sort of wear their student hats for a little while, kind of take the place of a student and how they would sort of react to a challenge. So we're at this time where I just kind of want to let everyone know, we'll reconvene our virtual webinars for the Siena Solutions Challenge in September. And if it is your first time sort of hearing about the challenge, we have a Siena Challenge website where essentially you'll be able to register as an educator to participate in the challenge. And once you're registered, we will add your name and your email address to our biweekly newsletter. And within the newsletter, you'll receive recordings and updates around the project and the challenge, and pretty much all information that you need to know to participate. And one more thing I also wanted to add, I think someone had a question, or I think Anthony, you had asked about the timeline for the dates of the challenge. And so we opened up registration in June 2021. So if you go on the website, you're more than welcome, and we invite you to register. In September 2021, we'll open up the submission platform or the submission portal where you'll be able to submit your challenges to this portal. And then in January 2022, the submission period will close. And by February 2022, all the challenge awards would be announced. And so I just wanted to give everyone a timeline. All of this information is at sienachallenge.org, and I will go ahead and add it to the chat box. Again, if you hadn't received it, and if you have any other questions or pieces of information that you want us to know, feel free to email sienachallenge@digitalpromise.org with your questions, and we will get back to you with an answer.
And if there are any questions outstanding right now, I have some time left, so I'm happy to answer them if there's any burning questions out there in the crowd. And if not, I just want to say thank you for showing up and participating today, and feel free to reach out with any other questions you have.
Awesome. Thanks, Anthony. I'll stick around too if anyone else wanted to ask any questions, but I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording.